Okay, today we're going to start a new read aloud. We're going to read What Was the Underground Railroad? So, as you know, in the United States, early in our history, we had slavery from the very beginning of the founding of colonies here until the Civil War finally ended it. So, we're going to read one way that slaves found to become free. So let's start with What was the Underground Railroad by Yona Zeldis McDonald. What was the Underground Railroad? On a March day in 1849, two men tossed a big wooden box onto a steamboat that was about to head up the Potomac River to Washington, D.C. Nobody cared how the box landed. The men thought it was just filled with something ordinary, but they were wrong. Inside the box was a real, live man. His name was Henry Brown. He was a slave escaping from Virginia. He was hoping to reach Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Slavery was illegal in Pennsylvania. He would be free there as long as slave catchers didn't find him and bring him back to the South. The box with Henry in it landed upside down. Now he was on his head. He was scared and, oh, how his head hurt. Would he ever get to Philadelphia? He didn't know. Although he was on a steamship, Henry was traveling on something called the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was not an actual railroad with metal tracks and passenger cars. It did not run underground. No one knows for sure where the name came from. It meant the escape route African American slaves took to reach freedom. One story says that in 1831, a slave named Tice Davids fled from Kentucky to Ohio. Kentucky was a slave state. Ohio was a free state. When David's master found out, he was shocked. It was as if Tice Davids had vanished into thin air. The master joked that his slave must have gone off on an underground railroad. Is this story true? No one knows for sure, but the term Underground Railroad stuck. Escaped slaves fled to free states and Canada any way they could. They often went on foot, traveling hundreds of miles. They went hidden in wagons. They went by train and by boat. They often went at night to avoid capture. Whites and other blacks along the way helped them. These people were called conductors. So here's a map of the United States in this time. It's 1860. The states with the little dots in them are free states, and the states with the lines are slave states. So Oregon and California were free states. These white states were just territory right then. They weren't really states. Up north, all of these states in the north are free states, and all of these states down here in the south, starting right here with Delaware and Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, and anything south of that, including Texas, those were all slave states. The journeys were scary and filled with danger. If caught, the slaves would be sent back and severely punished. But the danger did not stop them. Freedom was worth the risk. This is the story of some of these people, who they were, where they went, what happened to them along the way, and how their lives changed. Chapter 1. The Slave Trade. In 1619, a ship docked in Jamestown, Virginia. It carried about 20 people who had been kidnapped from their homes in West Africa. This marked the beginning of slavery in America. By 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the United States. Virginia and other states in the South depended on the free labor of slaves to work the fields on farms called plantations. Every year brought more slaves. They arrived on slave ships. The trip from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean was known as the Middle Passage. And so here's the United States up here in North America, and there's Virginia. So here across the ocean is Africa. They would take the slaves from right here off of the Gold Coast, and slaves would sail up to Virginia, over here to the West Indies, so Cuba in that area, and then over here to Brazil in South America. The journey typically lasted 4 to 6 weeks. However, it could take as long as 12 weeks. Even a short trip was awful. There were two ways for the captains to load their ships: loose packing and tight packing. Loose packing meant captains didn't take as many Africans as their ships could carry. More space and air for the slaves on board made it less likely that they would become sick and die. Healthy slaves brought a better price. Tight packing was much worse. The captain would crowd as many people into the ship as possible. They were packed like sardines in spaces that were sometimes no more than 18 inches high. There was barely room to move or even breathe. The captain didn't care. He figured that the more Africans on board, the more money he would make in America. If some died, so what? What was it like on a slave ship? Slaves were often chained ankle to wrist. There were no bathrooms. They used buckets instead. With no way to keep their living spaces clean, they came down with diseases like the flu and smallpox. To save money, some captains brought along very little food. As a result, many people starved to death. The middle passage was so horrible, some preferred to jump overboard and drown, or they simply stopped eating. If they survived the journey to America, the Africans were sold in auctions. This meant that white people bid money to buy them, just like they might buy a horse or a cow. Each person was sold to the highest bidder. Auctions were advertised with signs and in newspapers. At an auction, a large group of newly arrived black men, women, and children were put on display. White people came beforehand to inspect the group. They pried open their mouths to check their teeth. They pinched their muscles to measure their strength. No one cared about how the slaves felt. They were not considered human beings. Auctions tore families apart. After a mother was sold, she might have to watch one of her children get sold to an owner from a different state. Her baby would be yanked away from her, and there was nothing she could do about it. Husbands and wives, fathers and mothers, sisters and brothers were often sent to live on plantations far away from each other. In most cases, they never saw each other again. In 1808, the United States ended the slave trade. No more Africans could be brought to America for purchase. But the law didn't change anything for the enslaved people already in the United States. They were still slaves, and their children and grandchildren would be born slaves. So the number of slaves in America grew and grew. The only hope for a better life for these African Americans was to escape. Life on a plantation. Chapter 2. Slavery took root in the southern states because there was so much good farmland. Big plantations needed lots of workers to tend the crops, and slaves had to work for free. In the 1600s, many plantations grew tobacco. In the 1700s, the big crops in the South were rice and indigo. In the 1800s, the main crop was cotton. First, the slaves had to pluck little balls of cotton from the cotton plants. Next, they had to clean the cotton balls and get them ready for spinning. Then the cotton was spun and turned into cloth. The richest slave owners lived on big estates and might own as many as 400 slaves. So this is indigo. This is cotton. Had lots of little seeds. And this is rice. These slave owners lived like lords and ladies. They had fancy parties and dances. They went on hunts. They ate good food and wore expensive clothes. There were small plantations too. They were more like ordinary farms. The owners weren't rich and might own only a couple of slaves, but they certainly lived much better than their slaves did. And it was slave labor that supported all the plantations, large or small. A life of slavery was work, work, and more work. If they did something wrong, they were often beaten or whipped. Slave children did not go to school. In fact, slaves were forbidden to learn how to read or write. They could not vote or own a home. They couldn't own anything. Some slaves worked in the fields. A field slave worked from sunrise to sunset. Women worked as hard as men. Pregnant women worked in the fields right up until the birth of their babies. Then they worked with their babies strapped to their backs. Children over the age of 12 were expected to work as hard as adults. The field slaves were watched all day long by an overseer with a whip. The overseer was usually a white man. He made sure the slaves never wasted a moment. If they did, a flick of the whip made them get back to work. Field slaves usually lived in tiny huts with dirt floors. In winter, the huts were freezing cold. Instead of beds, they had only rough blankets and maybe some straw. At the end of the long day in the fields, slaves on a cotton plantation had to line up. Their cotton was weighed. They were expected to pick at least 200 pounds of cotton a day. Field slaves had Sundays off. Sometimes they were given Saturday afternoon off too, but not during harvest time. Then they might work an 18-hour day. House slaves worked mostly indoors. They cleaned, cooked, served meals, and took care of the master's children. They waited on tables, washed, ironed, swept, dusted, hoed, and weeded gardens. House slaves also did weaving, mending, quilting, and spinning. Some learned to make lace. House slaves often lived in closets or corners of the big house, even if the rest of their families lived in the slave quarters. Although they did not get Sundays off, most house slaves lived better than field slaves. House slaves sometimes even managed to learn how to read and write. But field or house, inside or out, one thing was certain: life as a slave was a nightmare. The dream of every enslaved person was to be free. And so next time we will read chapter 3, Abolition.